The Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic conflicts in England between the houses of Lancaster and York, both branches of the royal Plantagenet family. A war that unfolded between the years of 1455 and 1487. The name, the War of the Roses, comes from the emblems associated with the two rival houses, being the red rose for Lancaster and the white rose for York. The struggle was ignited by both political and economic issues, leadership disputes, and the quest for control over the throne of England, peaking with battles like Towton, which was among the bloodiest fought on English soil. The wars concluded with the ascent of Henry Tudor, that being Henry VII, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, which effectively ended Plantagenet rule and marked the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, it's good to meet you. If you're coming back, welcome to another one. As always, if you like what I do, there's a Patreon link in the description. Otherwise, trying to hit 6k subs, and we're quite close. A like, comment, and subscribe will certainly help me get there. Now, with that out of the way, let's begin. First, a deep breath, and make yourself comfortable. Let's start from the very beginning. The House of Plantagenet, originating from Anjou in France, ruled England from 1154 until 1485, concluding with the War of the Roses and the ascent of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII. This period marked a significant transformation in England's governance and national identity, propelled by conflicts with the French, Scots, Welsh, and Irish, and of course the formalization of English as the primary language. The Plantagenet reign saw the establishment of legal and feudal reforms, most notably the Magna Carta, I'm sure you're familiar with, which balanced the power of the monarchy with defined obligations to the realm. These reforms contributed to the emergence of a rather complex justice system and a budding sense of English nationhood. Now, during the 15th century, the Plantagenets endured defeats in the 100 Years' War, and of course faced mounting internal strife, marked by the widespread revolts and the rise of powerful noble factions. The internal discord culminated in our very topic for today, this War of the Roses, which pitted the two houses, Lancaster and York, against one another. Well, the subsequent Tudor period after this brought about a more centralized royal authority, sidestepping many of the challenges that had plagued the late Plantagenet rulers. So, speaking of these issues, we arrive to an issue itself, being Edward III. One of the notable Plantagenet kings. He had several sons who played significant roles in the nobility and the historical narrative of England. His creation of dukedoms for his sons introduced a new class of nobility that held substantial political and military power that was independent of the crown. This move laid the groundwork for what would become known as bastard feudalism, where nobles maintained private armies and could exert significant influence or opposition to the monarch. The term bastard feudalism, coined in the late 19th century, describes the evolution from traditional feudal levies to a system where nobles maintained loyalty through personal retainers rather than through feudal obligations. It was this shift that allowed nobles like John of Gaunt and later figures such as Richard of York and Warwick the Kingmaker to amass significant military and political power, challenging the authority of monarchs like Richard II and Henry VI. The House of Lancaster's claim to the throne was primarily through the aforementioned John of Gaunt, deriving legitimacy from a preference for the male line of succession. In contrast, the House of York's claim was rooted in descent from both the male and female lines, tying back to Lionel, Duke of Clarence. This divergence in claims fueled the rivalries and conflicts that characterized the Wars of the Roses, illustrating the complexity of lineage, feudal loyalty, and power in late medieval England. So, effectively to sum up, the creation of these dukedoms, while giving a little bit of people a bit of how can we put it, putting their mind at ease, giving them a little bit of power and sending them on their way to a different part of the country, it came back to bite them, as they all thought that they were the ones to take the throne. And, well, disputes in these sort of matters begin a lot more wars than religions do, in my opinion. Just like when a relative dies and there's an argument over the will. It's pretty much the same thing on a larger scale. Now, the question of succession following the death of Edward III in 1377 significantly contributed to the conflicts. Edward III was preceded by his eldest sons, that being Edward the Black Prince and Lionel of Antwerp, creating uncertainty over who was truly the rightful heir. Edward's grandson, Richard II, ascended to the throne as a child amidst this uncertainty, leading to a reign marked by regency and unrest. Edward's third son, John of Gaunt, and his descendants through the male line were initially favored in the line of succession over the descendants of Lionel of Antwerp, though who were through the female line. This set the stage for more dynastic disputes. Now, Richard II, his rule began under the influence of regencies dominated by his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt. His reign saw significant challenges, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which I just completed a full video on if you're interested. Also, his approach to governance was characterized by a shift towards absolute monarchy, which alienated the aristocracy and led to repeated conflicts with Parliament. Richard's aesthetic and peace-oriented policies contrasted sharply with the militaristic and administrative styles of his predecessors. His peace negotiations with France, which would have positioned England as a lesser power, were unpopular and rejected by the Parliament. His marriage to Isabella of Valois was part of these peace efforts, but did little to secure his position. Oh, and I should mention that Isabella was 6 years old at the time when she was married off to Richard II. There is a rather disturbing painting of this event. Ugh. Anyway, in 1399, the confiscation of the lands of John of Gaunt's exiled son, Henry Bolingbroke, following Gaunt's death, triggered Bolingbroke's return from exile, and ultimately led to Richard's deposition. Bolingbroke's ascent to the throne as Henry IV marked the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty. Well, Richard II's reign didn't last for too long. It ended in controversy and a little bit of tragedy, with his likely death in captivity. His policies and the manner of execution have been debated by historians, with some suggesting a possible personality disorder influencing his later actions. Of course, I'm going to make a full video on Richard II, which will be interesting, to say the least, so look forward to that. But either way, his legacy, heavily shaped by Shakespeare's betrayal and subsequent historical interpretation, remains complex, to say the least. Now on to Henry IV, whose early reign was marred by challenges and rebellion, starting with the Epiphany Rising in 1400, which was aimed at reinstating Richard, but it ended in the execution of the conspirators and Richard's mysterious death soon after. Well, in Wales, Owain Glyndwr spearheaded a significant rebellion that persisted beyond Henry's reign, only concluding in 1415. The Tudor family, linked to Glyndwr by marriage, later emerged as pivotal figures in the later Wars of the Roses. Now the House of Percy, dissatisfied with Henry's governance, staged multiple uprisings, notably at Shrewsbury in 1403 and Bramham Moor in 1408, both of which were quelled, resulting in the leaders' deaths. Henry IV's death in 1413 brought his son Henry V to the throne, who sought to stabilize his rule through military endeavors, notably in France. This Henry V leveraged French support for Glyndwr as a pretext for the 1415 invasion of France, culminating in the significant victory at Agincourt and the subsequent campaigns that solidified the Lancastrian claim to the French throne. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 marked a high point, designating Henry as the heir to the French throne through his marriage to Catherine of Valois. Domestically, the failed Southampton plot in 1415 aimed to replace Henry V with Edmund Mortimer, but it was thwarted by Mortimer's loyalty. This incident underscored ongoing domestic threats to Henry's rule, despite his international success. Well, upon Henry V's death in 1422, his infant son, Henry VI, quickly ascended the throne, leading to a period of regency. The young king's reign saw the rise of Richard of York, who possessed significant claims to the throne through both York and Mortimer lines, and became a formidable figure due to his vast estates and rather impressive wealth. During his early reign, Henry VI found himself amidst a court life with political machinations and rival factions. His uncle, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, aspired to be named Lord Protector until Henry reached maturity. Gloucester's ambition was not merely for power. He sought the approval of the populace, positioning himself as a champion of the common man. However, his plans were consistently held back by Cardinal Henry Beaufort, another influential figure at court, who frequently summoned John, Duke of Bedford, and Henry's regent in France, to mediate disputes or protect his position from Gloucester's challenges. The situation abroad was equally turbulent. The French, under the inspiration of Joan of Arc, had achieved significant victories at Orleans and Patay, effectively reversing many of the English gains from Henry V's campaigns. These losses culminated in the coronation of Charles VII in Reims on July 17, 1429, a significant blow to the English claims in France. Henry VI was crowned shortly thereafter on November 6th, a symbolic move meant to reaffirm his legitimacy and also to counteract Charles VII's coronation on the mainland. Around the same time, Henry's mother, Catherine of Valois, remarried to Owen Tudor, and their sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, would later play pivotal roles in the war. Henry's coming of age in 1437 should have marked the transition to a more stable rule, but the death of Bedford in 1435 and Beaufort's withdrawal from public life left a vacuum that William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, swiftly filled. Suffolk, favoring diplomacy over military confrontation, became a dominant force at court, often clashing with the Gloucester faction and militarily inclined Richard of York. Suffolk's influence peaked with the Treaty of Tours in 1444, which he engineered to secure the peace with France through Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in exchange for the territories of Maine and Anjou. Suffolk's elevation from Earl of Marquess and subsequently to Duke was a testament to his favor with the king. However, the secrecy surrounding the territorial concessions of the treaty bred suspicion and discontent among the English populace and nobility, particularly Richard of York, who saw his military efforts and resources being diverted to support Suffolk's diplomatic endeavors. In 1447, Suffolk's machinations led to the arrest of Gloucester for treason. His subsequent death, under suspicious circumstances, likely in prison, stirred further unrest among those opposed to Suffolk's policies. Furthermore, Richard of York was removed from a key military role in France and assigned to the less influential position of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, effectively sidelining him from immediate political influence. As England's political stability deteriorated, the Duke of Suffolk, William de la Pole, became increasingly influential at the court of King Henry VI. However, his handling of foreign policy, particularly the loss of Maine and Anjou to France as part of the marriage agreement between Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, made him very unpopular. The public and many nobles pointed the finger at him and held him responsible personally for these territorial concessions, which were perceived as national humiliations. The military setbacks in France, including the disastrous defeat at Formigny in April of 1450, further eroded Suffolk's standing. The same year, he faced the wrath of the House of Commons and was impeached. Henry VI intervened to mitigate the punishment by exiling him for 5 years instead of allowing his imprisonment. However, Suffolk was intercepted by pirates while en route to Calais and was executed in 1450, a clear indication of his unpopularity and also the volatile nature of English politics. Well, the downfall of Suffolk did not lead to a restoration of stability as a lot of people wanted. Instead, Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, took over as the leader of the peace faction at court, advocating for a diplomatic resolution to the ongoing conflicts in France. Somerset's position was precarious, as military failures continued and his close association with Queen Margaret of Anjou aroused suspicions and rumors of an affair, particularly after the birth of the royal couple's son, Prince Edward, in 1453. Well, it was further complicated by the Jack Cade Rebellion in 1450, a significant uprising in the region of Kent. The rebels, led by the rebellion's namesake, Jack Cade, issued the Complaint of the Poor Commons of Kent, accusing the government of corruption and mismanagement. Although the rebellion was suppressed, its underlying causes and grievances lingered and were later adopted by Richard, the Duke of York, as part of his critique against the government's failures. Richard of York's return from Ireland and his subsequent imprisonment highlighted the deep divisions within the English nobility. These tensions were exacerbated by Henry's apparent mental health issues, which led to periods of incapacity and ineffective leadership. Could you imagine having a ruler with mental health issues that led to periods of ineffective leadership? How could they let that happen? Well, this instability culminated in the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, a direct confrontation between the Yorkists and the Royalist forces led by Somerset. And this, 23 minutes into the video indeed, marks the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. Yes, it was quite a wind-up to that, I know, but it's important to set the background. Well, Henry VI's recovery from his mental breakdown in 1455 temporarily shifted the balance of power back to his loyalists, leading to the release and the restoration of Somerset and the exile of Richard of York. However, the political and military situation remained as volatile as before, with ongoing feuds, such as those between the Nevilles and the Percys, further complicating the governance of the country. In the intricate weave of the 15th century politics, the Yorkist leaders, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, and Richard, the Duke of York, managed to capture Henry VI during this aforementioned Battle of St. Albans, setting a decisive course for a new war. This victory not only secured Henry VI as a pawn in their political maneuverings, but also led to significant casualties among their Lancastrian adversaries, including the influential Edmund Beaufort, 2nd Duke of Somerset, and Henry Percy, the 2nd Earl of Northumberland. The death of these key figures allowed York to be reinstated as the Lord Protector, signifying a temporary Yorkist ascendancy in English politics. Warwick's command over the strategically vital port of Calais further fortified the Yorkist position. This control provided him not only with a military stronghold, but also with the ability to conduct naval raids, which, while contentious, underscored his naval skill and only served to add to his reputation. Despite Queen Margaret of Anjou's attempts to curb his influence, Warwick's successful anti-piracy measures, and his unauthorized naval attacks against Castilian and Hanseatic forces underscored his defiance of royal authority, which actually enhanced his stature greatly within Yorkist circles. However, there was a shift in 1456, when Henry VI resumed his personal rule, diminishing York and Warwick's influence. This period of relative stability was short-lived, as the ongoing feud between the Neville and Percy families flared up again. The situation was further complicated by Warwick's provocative actions in 1458, which included attacks on foreign fleets, leading to his and York's summons to London to answer for their actions. Fearing imprisonment, or perhaps worse, they consolidated their forces and prepared for a conflict. The tension culminated in the Battle of Blore Heath in 1459, where Yorkist forces, under the command of the Earl of Salisbury, secured a victory against a larger Lancastrian force. This victory was pivotal, reaffirming Yorkist military capabilities despite the growing Lancastrian opposition, which had been actively recruiting and arming under Queen Margaret's direction. The Yorkist leaders' decision to flee to Calais in the face of a reinvigorated Lancastrian campaign led by Queen Margaret marked a strategic retreat, but it also set the stage for a significant Yorkist counteroffensive. The control of Calais played a crucial role in maintaining Yorkist strategic options, enabling them to gather resources and plan their return to England with a more strengthened military force. Now, by late 1460, Warwick, Salisbury, and Edward of March, later King Edward IV, had returned to England, quickly gathering support and capturing Henry VI at the Battle of Northampton. The victory provided the Yorkists with another opportunity to assert control over the government. The subsequent political manoeuvrings saw York making a bold claim to the throne, which, while initially shocking to the Assembly, led to the Act of Accord. This agreement stipulated that York and his descendants would succeed Henry VI, a compromise that reflected the Yorkist leaders' consolidation of power, but also sowed the seeds for further conflict, as it was unacceptable to staunch Lancastrian supporters, and that included Queen Margaret. The death of Richard of York marked a pivotal moment in the Wars of the Roses, dramatically altering the Yorkist leadership and also their strategy. Queen Margaret, alongside the Lancastrian supporters such as Henry Holland, the 3rd Duke of Exeter, and Jasper Tudor, rallied troops in Wales and the West Country, securing additional military support from Scotland and France in exchange for territorial concessions, a testament to the international dimension of the conflict. Richard of York's decision to leave the safety of Sandal Castle and engage the Lancastrians was the event that directly led to his death, and significant Yorkist losses at the Battle of Wakefield on 30th of September 1460. This defeat not only resulted in York's death, but also the capture and execution of his allies, including his son, the Earl of Rutland, and the influential Earl of Salisbury. The events necessitated a rapid reorganization of Yorkist leadership under Edward, the Earl of March, Richard of York's son, who inherited not only the dukedom of York, but also his father's claim to the English throne, and he felt just as strongly about the latter. Now, in early 1461, Edward decisively defeated the Lancastrian forces at Mortimer's Cross, leveraging celestial phenomena to boost troop morale and adopting the sun in splendor as his heraldic symbol. Despite his victory, the Lancastrians achieved a strategic advantage with their success at the Second Battle of St. Albans, releasing King Henry VI and reasserting his rule. The dynamic shifted quickly, however, as Edward VI was proclaimed king in London, an indication of his popularity and also the city's rejection of the Lancastrian claim. His physical presence and charismatic leadership contrasted sharply with Henry VI's perceived weakness, helping Edward solidify his position even more. Edward and Warwick's subsequent march north culminated in the Battle of Towton, the largest and bloodiest ever fought on English soil, resulting in a decisive Yorkist victory that effectively annihilated the Lancastrian leadership and confirmed Edward's sovereignty. Thus, King Edward IV's reign, following his coronation on the 28th of June 1461, marked a period of consolidation. His decision to pardon many attainted Lancastrians showed a strategic effort to stabilize his reign by reconciling with former foes, allowing them to even retain their properties and former titles, which helped pacify potential sources of dissent. Warwick, known as the King-Maker, enjoyed immense benefits from Edward's rise, gaining vast lands, titles, and key positions such as High Admiral of England and Steward of the Duchy of Lancaster. In fact, his influence extended to international diplomacy, successfully securing a truce with Scotland and solidifying Yorkist control in Ireland, demonstrating his pivotal role in both domestic and foreign affairs. However, this did not mean everything was stable. In 1462, Margaret of Anjou made attempts to reclaim lost ground by capturing key northern castles with French support, though these efforts were transient, showcasing the ongoing volatility. By 1463, the next year, internal conflicts resurfaced as northern England rose in support of Henry VI, leading to further confrontations, and the significant Battle of Hexham in 1464, where Yorkist forces decisively defeated the Lancastrians. This victory led to the capture and execution of prominent Lancastrian leaders, and even the capture of Henry VI, who was then imprisoned in the Tower of London, effectively quelling any significant Lancastrian resistance. Edward's marriage in 1464 to Elizabeth Woodville was a pivotal event that shaped much of his subsequent reign. This union was controversial due to Elizabeth's relatively modest social background and the secrecy surrounding their wedding. This marriage alienated Warwick, who felt sidelined and betrayed after promoting a French alliance and a royal marriage to solidify peace and international support. Edward's choice undermined Warwick's position and inflamed tensions within the Yorkist alliance. The rise of the Woodville family into prominent positions further strained relationships with the nobility, particularly Warwick, who saw his influence waning as the Woodvilles ascended in court. Things became increasingly complex as Edward pursued an independent policy, favouring an alliance with Burgundy over France, contradicting Warwick's diplomatic efforts and leading to further alienation. Thus, Edward's actions set the stage for future conflicts, not only with the Lancastrian adherents, but with his own court, which was filled with disgruntled nobles, led by Warwick and supported by Edward's own brother, George the Duke of Clarence. And they were all conspiring against him. In the turbulence of 1469, England was shaken by uprisings and power struggles, culminating in significant clashes and the temporary capture of King Edward IV. A rebellion in Yorkshire under Robin of Redesdale, coupled with another revolt, demanded the restoration of Henry Percy as Earl of Northumberland, demonstrated widespread dissatisfaction with Edward's rule. These revolts were ostensibly aimed at removing perceived evil counsellors around the king, but were fueled by more deep factional manipulations by Warwick and George, who sought to exploit the unrest for their own gain. Warwick and Clarence's machinations included marrying Clarence to Warwick's daughter Isabel in Calais, a strategic move to consolidate their power base against Edward. Upon returning to England, they aligned themselves with the Yorkshire rebels, leading to a significant confrontation at the Battle of Edgecote, where prominent royal supporters were killed and Edward was captured. The capture highlighted the fragility of Edward's position, and of course this formidable challenge posed by Warwick and Clarence. The initial success of the rebels, however, did not translate into a stable government. The lack of broader support for Warwick and Clarence, combined with ongoing disorder, forced them to release Edward, who quickly went back to his royal duties. The political instability persisted, leading to further conflicts such as the Battle of Losecoat Field, where Edward decisively crushed a rebellion influenced by Warwick and Clarence, solidifying his control and forcing his adversaries into a temporary exile. The situation escalated further when Warwick, in a remarkable turn of alliances facilitated by Louis XI of France, reconciled with his bitter enemy Margaret of Anjou, in a bid to restore Henry VI to the throne. This alliance was sealed by the marriage of Warwick's daughter Anne to Edward of Westminster, Margaret and Henry's son. In September 1470, using a two-pronged invasion strategy and exploiting internal royal conflicts, Warwick successfully deposed Edward, leading to a brief reinstallation of Henry VI, a period that was known as the readeption of Henry. However, the restored Lancastrian regime was short-lived. Internal divisions, the lack of solid support, and external pressures quickly undermined Warwick's control. Edward, with substantial support from Burgundy, returned to England in 1471, gathering forces rapidly and gaining crucial allies, including the defection of Clarence back to his side. The climactic battle at Barnet in April 1471 saw the end of Warwick, and marked a decisive turn in the Wars of the Roses in the favour of Edward IV. The battle was characterized by tragic miscommunication among the Lancastrian forces, and a fierce assault by Edward's troops capitalizing upon it, leading to Warwick's death and a crippling blow to the Lancastrian cause. Edward's return to power was solidified by his decisive victories and strategic political maneuvers, which included plenty of reconciliations and also retributions against his enemies. However, he did not last too long. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 marked the end of his influential reign, initiating a period of profound uncertainty and instability in England. Edward's decision to appoint his brother Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector for his young son Edward V set the stage for significant power struggles. Now, Richard of Gloucester's role as Lord Protector was meant to be a temporary arrangement until Edward V came to age. However, things shifted as Richard took steps to consolidate power around himself. Who could have seen that coming? Within a short period, Richard moved to isolate his young nephews and arrest their loyal supporters. By the June of 1483, Richard had successfully declared the children of Edward IV all illegitimate, based on accusations of a pre-contract of marriage between Edward IV and a different woman prior to his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, thus completely disqualifying Edward V from the throne. Well, it seemed to have worked, because on the 26th of June 1483 Richard was proclaimed king, notably King Richard III, significantly altering the course of English history. The rapid change in governance led to widespread speculation and discontent among various factions within the realm. The mystery regarding the fate of Edward IV's sons, known historically as the Princes in the Tower, fueled further discontent, as they disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The country effectively made a collective eyebrow raise, and they were widely believed to have been murdered. Now, Richard III's reign faced immediate challenges, including invasions and rebellions, which was the style at the time. Notably, Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant with a rather tenuous claim to the throne, that being said, gathered support in France and launched an invasion in 1485. The culmination of these conflicts occurred at the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August 1485, where Richard III was actually killed. Well, this was the top moment of the Wars of the Roses, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. Now, Henry VII worked to consolidate his power and heal the divisions caused by decades of civil war. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, thus uniting the houses of Lancaster and York, marking the beginning of a relatively stable period in English history. Of course, this all had to come crashing down. The conspiracy against Richard III rapidly gained momentum, supported by both disenfranchised Yorkists and those with Lancastrian sympathies, who saw Henry Tudor a viable alternative to the controversial Richard. Of course, he wasn't as controversial as Richard II with his 6-year-old wife, but ugh. Anyway, the discontent was fueled by the mystery surrounding the fate of the princes in the Tower, Richard's nephews, which cast a long shadow over his reign for rather obvious reasons. The disappearance of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury provided a focal point for opposition, as it embodied the fears and suspicions many held about Richard's methods and intentions. Now, as we've said, Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was tenuous at best, but his promise to marry Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, offered a potential unification of the warring houses of York and Lancaster. This alliance was intended to reconcile the divide that had led to decades of civil war, offering a new vision for a stable and united England. Elizabeth Woodville's backing of Henry Tudor, despite her previous allegiance to the House of York under Edward IV, was more of a strategic move. It reflected the pragmatic shifts in loyalty that characterized the turbulent politics of the time, and highlighted the adaptability of political figures who were only seeking to survive, but if they could, thrive amid the shifting allegiances and fortunes of the Wars of the Roses. The Duke of Buckingham, once a staunch supporter of Richard III, played a pivotal role in the growing conspiracy due to personal grievances and ambitions that were not satisfied under Richard's reign. His defection to the Tudor cause was significant, as it not only deprived Richard of a key ally, but also lent substantial legitimacy to the rebellion. Things were not looking good for Richie. The convergence of these disaffected parties under the banner of Henry Tudor underscored the broad base of the opposition to Richard, and set the stage for the climactic conflict at the Bosworth field. It was here the forces of Richard III and Henry Tudor would ultimately clash, determining the fate of the English crown and marking the definitive end of the Plantagenet dynasty. The Battle of Bosworth Field not only ended Richard III's brief reign, but also marked a decisive turning point in English history, signalling the final conclusion of the Wars of the Roses and the emergence of the Tudor dynasty. His victory, Henry Tudor's that is, was less about his claim to the throne, which was pretty tenuous, and more about his ability to consolidate support across factions, weary of decades of civil strife. Also, generally, people were just a little bit sick of fighting each other, I think, and they didn't really care which side won, as long as they could just go back to having normal lives. Well, at least, that's what I assume the common people would be thinking. War definitely takes a toll on you. Now, Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, inaugurated a period of relative stability and the centralization of power in the monarchy, a contrast to the feudal conflict that had been characterizing much of the 15th century. His marriage to Elizabeth of York effectively united the warring houses of Lancaster and York, symbolizing the end of dynastic conflicts and the beginning of a bright new era in English governance. The significance of the Battle of Bosworth Field extends beyond its immediate military outcome, as it reshaped the English monarchy and set the stage for the political transformations of the Renaissance and the cultural transformations of the Reformation that would sweep through Europe. This new Tudor era, beginning with Henry Tudor, Henry VII, would see the strengthening of the administrative capabilities of the state, the expansion of overseas exploration, and significant shifts in religious policies. Henry VII's reign brought about more important changes in governance, including the establishment of the Court of the Star Chamber, which helped reduce the influence of the nobility by centralizing legal authority. His economic policies, often categorized by heavy taxation and stringent control over the nobility's financial powers, laid the groundwork for later successors and also challenges of his successors, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Videos on them very, very soon. Thus, this Battle of Bosworth Fields represents not merely the end of a period of bloody conflict, but also the beginning of a bright new dawn. Perhaps not as bright as it should be, but certainly brighter by contrast. Now, Henry's response to the various uprisings and pretenders throughout his reign shows once again the fragility of his hold on the throne and his determination to establish a stable dynasty. His actions to suppress revolts and manage claims against his rule were part of a broader strategy to solidify Tudor legitimacy and stabilize England after decades of civil war. And speaking of these rebellions, by pardoning the one Lambert Simnel, a figurehead of a rather significant rebellion, Henry not only neutralized a threat, but he also displayed a kind of magnanimity that could appease potential Yorkist sympathizers. His decision to employ Simnel in a humble but stable position within the royal household allowed him to demonstrate both mercy and the absolute futility of opposing his reign. This act was a clear message to other would-be pretenders and their supporters about the futility of their claims and the potential benevolence of the Tudor regime. Perkin Warbeck's claim presented a more direct challenge, however, as it drew on international support and prolonged Yorkist factionalism. Henry's eventual capture and execution of Warbeck and the simultaneous execution of Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, marked a harsher but decisive action to eliminate viable Plantagenet threats. The execution of Warwick, a genuine Plantagenet, with a legitimate, albeit pretty weak, claim to the throne, underscores the lengths to which Henry was prepared to go to secure the future of his dynasty. This act extinguished the direct male Plantagenet line, sending a stark warning to anybody considering supporting claims against the Tudors. Moreover, Henry's strategic marriages for his children, notably the marriage of his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, and the betrothal of his daughter Margaret to James IV of Scotland, were part of this diplomatic strategy to forge alliances and legitimize his dynasty through European recognition. Henry's reign ultimately laid the groundwork for the Tudor dynasty, which would preside over a period of relative internal stability and the beginnings of what is deemed to be an English Renaissance. His efforts to stabilize the monarchy through strategic executions, careful management of noble factions, and internal diplomacy show the complexity of his rule alongside the challenges to hold on to the throne. Thus, it's a reign that's not only navigating the immediate aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, but also set the stage for the transformative rule of his son, Henry VIII, and his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, who would oversee the flowering of English culture and expansion on the global stage. Thank you very much for listening. That was a rather brief introduction to the Wars of the Roses, and I know a lot of moving parts. Now, as for some of the characters, like Henry Tudor, Elizabeth I at the end, Henry VIII, and some of the other monarchs mentioned, they will have their own biographies coming up, also a video on the Battle of Bosworth Field. But until then, you'll just have to wait a little longer. Now I want to thank my top-tier patrons, that is Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, and Susan. Thank you very much. And if you would like to become a Patreon subscriber, then you know what to do. But no pressure. Just enjoy the video. Thank you for listening. Good night, everyone.